Well, kia ora tātou. It's lovely to be here. It's lovely to see so many of you still here. One of the often awful things about the closing time in a conference is everybody's left, and there's about 13 people left in the room, so it's great that you're all still here. So what I've been asked to do is to give you some observations on the conference, but also on the sector for the last 25 years, because it's actually been 25 years since we called together the first Philanthropy New Zealand conference. But before I start, I just want to say that it was quite profound having sort of two arms of the Rockefeller philanthropies with us, and I don't know if Justin and Mei Hong are still here, but I did a little Google search, as you do, and looked at some of John Dee Rockefeller's famous quotations. And I've just got a few here to kind of set the scene, because it's extraordinary sometimes with some leaders how the words that they say or the words that they write continue to resonate, often over 100 years after they were written. So the first one I picked out was, if you want to succeed, you should strike out on new paths, rather than travel the worn paths of accepted success. And I think that would ring a lot of bells for those of us who are working with communities on trying to find new solutions to entrenched problems. Don't be afraid to give up the good to go for the great. So I think Jim Collins probably needs to acknowledge where he got the title of his book from. But it's an interesting one, isn't it? Don't be afraid to give up the good to go for the great. Another one, charity is injurious unless it helps the recipient to become independent of it, which I think is a really profound statement. And giving should be entered into in just the same way as investing. Giving is investing. So I think those are some quite profound thoughts for us as we enter into sort of the final hour of this conference. So 25 years ago, we had the first meeting of what was then called the New Zealand Association of Philanthropic Trusts. And Philanthropy New Zealand, or the New Zealand Association of Philanthropic Trusts, as it was known then, was really an initiative of Sir Roy Mackenzie and his good friends Sir John Todd and Graham and John Sutherland. And Graham Sutherland, I know you're here. Are you still here? He's still here. Is there anyone else here who was at that first meeting in the James Cook Hotel in Wellington 25 years ago? Is there anyone else? No, it's really interesting, isn't it? I was talking with John about it before. I think there were about 30 of us at the first meeting. Nobody knew anybody else. And somebody said to me, could you think about what the words and phrases and themes of that meeting were and compare them to today's meeting? And most of the words and phrases and themes were, hello, who are you? My name's blah, blah, blah. What do you do? Oh, that's interesting. This is what we do. I mean, it's just so interesting to think about how the sector has grown and matured over those last 25 years. One of the things that was interesting was that probably the biggest group represented in the room was actually the trusts in the trustee companies. And obviously the trustee companies sector has gone through a lot of changes in that time. But I remember talking to somebody from a company who shall remain nameless and asking him how many philanthropic trusts he administered, and he just looked at me completely blankly and said, I don't have the faintest idea. So it was just interesting. There was very little sector knowledge, very little thought about philanthropy as a sector. John reminded me, though, that the first speaker we had at that conference was Sir Paul Reeves, who was then the Governor-General of New Zealand, and he spoke about Māori and philanthropy. So it's interesting that that's been a theme that Philanthropy New Zealand has constantly had on our conference agendas, and that theme has developed, I think, quite significantly, particularly with the presentation that we had yesterday afternoon from Tarmac Solomon and from Manuka Henry this morning. Philanthropy New Zealand was established by the J.R. Mackenzie Trust in recognition of the 50th anniversary of the J.R. Mackenzie Trust, and Sir Roy Mackenzie was aware at the time of the Council on Foundations and of Philanthropy Australia, and he wanted to see the establishment of a voice for New Zealand philanthropy, but also a conduit for international discussion and international dialogue. So it was lovely to follow on from Alan English and the number of other international speakers that we've had here, because it was clearly Sir Roy's intent when he set the organisation up that we would be part of the international dialogue on philanthropy. Just some other observances. At that conference 25 years ago, nobody was employed full-time in philanthropy, and there were probably half a dozen of us who worked for philanthropic trusts. Most people worked in philanthropic trusts were people who had worked for the family company and, say, had been the company secretary or the PA to the chief executive, and they were given the job of running the philanthropic trust as a kind of a part-time job that you did when you really didn't have much else to do and you could kind of do it in your spare time. So what's happened in the past 25 years since then? There's been significant growth in giving and in the diversity of the sector. So we've seen the emergence of the trustee savings bank trusts. So although they had been established at the time of the first conference, none of them were there, but there were quite a few represented at the second conference 2 years later. We then had the rise of the energy trusts, the gaming trusts. Another thing that was very obvious to me looking about it is the participation of sponsors over the past 25 years. And sponsors have become increasingly important to philanthropy in New Zealand, not only because of their financial support of the conference, but also the intellectual input that they put in. And it was interesting to see how many workshops were offered in this program by the various conference sponsors. I think the other interesting thing we've seen in New Zealand over that time is the steady growth of family foundations. So we saw the Tyndall Foundation formed after that time, the Wayne Francis Trust, and most recently the Next Foundation, along with a number of others. So we're seeing sort of a slow but significant growth in family philanthropy. And as I mentioned before, quite significant change in the corporate structure around trustee companies, and a significant growth in Māori philanthropy and Māori grant making and engagement between Māori grant makers and other grant makers in other pieces of the sector. One of my observations on New Zealand philanthropy is that it kind of reflects our natural character, I think. Many, particularly in the family foundation sector, are very modest, very understated, don't want public recognition, want to work below the radar screen. Some of you may be aware that I'm a trustee on a small family trust that was established 22 years ago by a single woman, an elderly woman who actually very sadly passed away last year. And for 22 years I ran her trust for her. And she said to me once, if anybody finds out that I'm giving this money away, I'm going to close the trust down. So for 22 years we protected her privacy. But we said to her when she was in her 90s and she was not well, and we said to her, when you, can't remember what polite word I used, but when I'm able to, I would like to name something that the trust does after you. And she kind of looked at me and nodded. We got to know each other really well in 20 years. She said, oh, all right, Jenny. So when she died, we were actually able to name a chair at Victoria University after her, the Diana Unwin Chair in Restorative Justice. But it was just a really interesting example of someone who was giving away some years close to $1 million for nearly 20 years, but who really didn't want it to be, certainly not to be acknowledged or to be recognised. And I think that there are many, many more philanthropists like Diana in New Zealand society than we really understand. I think family foundations in particular are becoming increasingly focused on a few critical issues: children, youth not in education and employment and environment. And I think less and less of, fewer and fewer grant makers are doing widespread grant making, and more of us are becoming strategic and focused in what we do. I think also increasingly we are forging closer connection with our grantees. I think the other thing that's really obvious at a conference like this is the emergence of a professional philanthropic workforce. I suspect there's at least 200 people employed in philanthropy now across New Zealand, most of us full-time. And to quote Dee Rockefeller again, Justin said that his view was that you hired professionals who are better at this, i.e. grant making, than you are. And it's actually a really nice combination, I think, the combination of the business person or the entrepreneur with the philanthropic advisor or the manager of the philanthropic trust working alongside them. I know when I worked for Sir Roy Mackenzie, I had an office next to his, and there was one of those little windows, where CEOs used to, pull it open and say, Miss Jones, bring me a cup of tea, or Miss Jones, come in and take a letter. So Roy would open this little window and put a letter through and say, do you think we should fund this? And I would read it and get out of my chair and walk around and walk into his office and say, yeah, I think we should. And so I would then go to Miss Jones, who would type the letter, because in those days we didn't have computers and I couldn't type. And then I would write out the cheque, countersign it, take it into him, he'd countersign it, put it in an envelope and post it off. That was called rapid philanthropy. And responsive. So 25 years on, it's the first time Philanthropy New Zealand's had a conference outside of Wellington, and it came here to this beautiful facility in Auckland, founded, of course, by a substantial gift from a New Zealand philanthropist. 470 people registered, and I was thinking that really, in many ways, conferences in sectors like this are kind of a barometer of both the size, the breadth, the depth, but also the health of any sector. And I think that looking at this conference, looking at the range of people who are here, looking at the very high level of engagement that everybody's had with each other and with the speakers, that we can say that we do have a highly engaged and dynamic sector in New Zealand. I think it's been lovely to welcome new foundations. It was great yesterday to have the announcement of the MediaWorks Foundation, and hopefully there'll be many more. I also noted that IT has finally made it to PNZ with Show Gizmo. Now, those of us who are not millennials might have had some difficulty with it, but my children would have been absolutely appalled if they could have seen me yesterday morning trying to help Genevieve Timmins download it onto her iPad. If you ask my children, I'm the last person to give you any advice whatsoever about IT. But for those of us who got our heads around it, I think it's been a very, very interesting tool. And the other interesting thing I observed is that we've got at least 2 vendors out there in the sponsors room who are now marketing their wares to the philanthropic sector. And that's a big change in the philanthropic sector in New Zealand, and the use that the sector is putting IT to. And we're all tweeting. I'm tweeting. A bit hard to believe it, but I am. It's also really significant to have such a large Australian contingent here. I have to say, I've been to every single Philanthropy Australia conference in the last 25 years, and I've been wanting for a really long time to have more of a trans-Tasman dialogue, because I do think there's an enormous amount we can learn from each other. So it's really, really great to have you here, and I hope that we can actually work. Philanthropy Australia and Philanthropy New Zealand can work more closely together in future. I mean, it's very interesting thinking about the things that change philanthropy, but Liz Gillies came to a conference at Te Papa in 2006 and gave a presentation about high engagement philanthropy. And that single presentation has resonated through so much of the change in philanthropy in New Zealand, because she gave us, there's been a lot of talk about toolboxes and tools. I think that single presentation gave a number of us the language and the tools and the structure that we were looking for to kind of encapsulate the ideas around where we wanted to go. I also think that Philanthropy New Zealand, you've been walking the talk. I loved the gifts that you made to UNICEF in the name of the speakers. I think that's a terrific thing to do. And the fact that the leftover lunch goes through Kibosh. Now, yesterday we sent 12 kilos of food to the City Mission, which became 120 meals for people who couldn't believe their eyes at what they were being served. The New Zealand philanthropic sector has a different profile from many other countries. We're small in scale, but then we are also a small and interconnected country. The statutory trusts make up over 80% of the giving in New Zealand, and the family and voluntary trusts the other portion. We also have nearly 36% of the money in the last survey coming from gaming trusts. So the profile of giving in New Zealand is quite different from that in Australia or the United States. I think that the changes in New Zealand society are also reflected in the changing participation in Philanthropy New Zealand conferences. I think I was the only woman at the conference 25 years ago. In fact, someone came into a meeting the other day and looked around and said, "Where are all the other blokes?" And we said, "Oh, don't worry, we believe in gender diversity. There are going to be 3 of you in this meeting." I also think one of the really interesting challenges that we're facing is our relationship with government. And it's been interesting, there are a number of government officials here who are working with different trusts and foundations. And the Next Foundation, for example, are working quite proactively with DOC around pest control. The Ministry of Education have worked quite strongly alongside Spark and ASB Community Trust around Manaia Kalani. When I used to work for dear Sir Roy Mackenzie, at one stage Ruth Dyson, the Honourable Ruth Dyson, who was the Minister for Disability Affairs, asked to see us, and we went into her office, and Ruth was at her most charming, and she said to Roy Mackenzie, she said, "Roy, I know you have lots of really good ideas, but I can't fund them all." So I think it's really interesting, that interface between philanthropy and government, and how do we elevate the discussion about the things that matter to government, whether it's to ministers, whether it's to local officials, or whether it's to more senior officials. And at the same time, one of the undercurrents that I've picked up in this conference is great concern that philanthropy is increasingly being expected to fill in as both central and local governments withdraw their funding from areas that they have traditionally funded in. And I can see lots of heads nodding. So I do think it's a really interesting issue. On the one hand, we're stepping closer to government and working much more in partnership with government than we would have as a sector 10 or 20 years ago. But on the other hand, I think some people are feeling they're being pushed too hard in that direction. So I think that's an issue we're going to just keep our eyes on over the next few years. Yesterday, Kate outlined 3 areas of challenge for the sector: youth and employment, environment, and inequity. And there are some other issues that have come up that I think it's worth thinking about. One is the diversity of our communities. And some of you will know that I moved up here 10 years ago, and for a while I used to say I was a refugee from Wellington, but I'm not sure after 10 years I can say that. But actually, Auckland is a very, very different city, even from what it was when I moved up here 10 years ago. And the increasing diversity of New Zealand as a community, but in particular the northern part of the country, isn't necessarily reflected in this conference. It isn't reflected in the participants, and it would be interesting to know if it's reflected in the communities that receive our grants. I think we were thrown a challenge this morning by Dame Anne Salmond around conservation and environmental projects. It's one of the areas in which philanthropy, the level of philanthropic contribution is the lowest, and Dame Anne very gently and kindly told us that she found us quite difficult to work with in the nicest possible way. So I think that's a challenge. And the other really interesting challenge, I think, is engagement with young people. And I was thinking how many of us say that we want to focus on children and young people, but actually I think we're a bit bewildered about how to engage with that cohort of people who are aged somewhere between 15 and about 25. It's easy to talk about 0 to 5s because we can sort of do it to them. When we start talking about 15 to 30-year-olds or 15 to 25-year-olds, we have to, as an organisation, thinking about actually how do we do it with them and where is their voice. And there are very, very few of those people in this room with us today. The other challenge that one of the trusts raised in another meeting was the issue for New Zealand of intergenerational employment. And the CEO of this foundation said to me that their board had a discussion recently about groups of their community where nobody may ever have a permanent full-time job. So that's a complete change in the sort of New Zealand that I grew up in, you know, where every dad went out of the door at 8:30 every morning, off to a job, and had morning tea, afternoon tea, lunch, got on the same bus at 5 o'clock every day and came home, went to the same job for 35 years. So the changes in New Zealand society are all challenges that we as philanthropists and people who work in the philanthropic sector need to engage in. I think one of the challenges for Philanthropy New Zealand is to engage with the below-the-radar givers. There are a lot of givers in Auckland who are not in this room because they're not choosing formal philanthropy as a mechanism for giving. So how do we as a sector, and how does Philanthropy New Zealand as an organisation engage with those givers? And similarly, corporate givers. There's a lot of corporate giving going on and, you know, we're in Auckland, where are the corporate givers? So I do think Philanthropy New Zealand, there is some more engagement to be had there, and I think increasingly we will find the need for greater Māori engagement, which Philanthropy New Zealand as an organisation has been working quite hard on over the past few years. So now I'd like to tell you a little bit about what we heard from you. So the two buzzwords that came back through Show Gizmo were acupuncture points and wicked problems, and those words just came through from so many of you. Just a little bit of feedback here. Feedback about Justin Rockefeller talking about that for-profit can also be philanthropic, that values count, there's need to work more closely with business, that inequality is a really important and complex issue that requires innovative philanthropic approaches, that philanthropy needs to work on structural issues that allow inequality to become entrenched. Mark Solomon's speech, I think, resonated with a lot of you. The tweeting went up through the stratosphere. What's good for Māori is good for the nation. How will we work differently, improve engagement with Māori, try to lift our game, try to engage with local iwi on educational partnership opportunities? Mei Hong's keynote obviously resonated with a whole lot of people, the idea of wicked problems, the idea of social justice not necessarily being a radical idea, but focusing on the underlying causes of social problems. Doing things differently, we'll practice empathy and we'll urge our trust to be bold and deliberate about what we want to change. Anne Salmond was seen as inspirational and outstanding. People talked about aligning values with where the money is invested, showing values through the stories of your recipients, sharing data on your performance and your impact, sticking with it even when the going gets tough, which is quite a challenge for us, shared imperatives, real actions needed, getting out of your office and networking, looking for leaders first before you invest, corporates aligning their giving to inspire their employees and retain them. Relationships are key to how you work. Philanthropic foundations can help highlight and reframe the issues in ways people can understand. I also like the idea of fairy dust, those of you who went to Mei Hong's session the other night. What I'm hearing people talk about, philanthropy is the gift exchange in which both parties benefit and the opportunity to develop a uniquely Kiwi approach to philanthropy. Philanthropy is not something that is done to recipients. Very important. Now, I loved the tweeting. How many of you tweeted? Very good, very good. So the stats on tweeting, over the 2 days there have been 456 posts, there were 104 users with a reach of 102,000, what do you call Twitter recipients? Tweeties? Tweetettes? The peak was at 4 o'clock yesterday, with 78 tweets per hour, and then again at 9 o'clock this morning. Now, I decided that there should be one more prize, and it's another bottle of South Island wine, Central Otago Pinot Noir, and this was for the person who sent out the best tweets, and in fact, the best 2 tweets came from the same person. And the prize-winning tweet for me was Alan J. English, best socks at the Philanthropy Summit 2015. But in fact, the prize-winning tweet was from Lani Evans. We need to give young peeps positive examples of secure and innovation to lift the perception that smothers our hopes. So well done, Lani. And thank you, everybody.